Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Johnny Gass, and I'm very excited to be moderating today's session on U.S. Africa policy in Trump's second term on behalf of Invest Africa. For those of you who don't know, Invest Africa is a leading business platform that really works to support corporates, investors, and policymakers to navigate and unlock opportunities across the continent. And now for today's discussion, well, really, where do we begin? We're just shy of 100 days into President Trump's second term. And of course, I don't know about you, but it's really been quite a busy period already. It feels like maybe a full year has passed in just this short time. What we've seen, over 70 executive orders signed. We've seen a huge wave of new tariffs on about 90 countries, including many key African trading partners. We've seen trade wars threatened, some in other cases very much launched. We've seen multilateralism really sidelined. We've seen USAID dismantled. And yet at the same time, we've seen Washington really look to deepen its footprint in critical mineral markets, talk quite tough on China, and look to pour new capital into to strategic investment corridors like Lobito. So what does this all mean, and what comes next? I think that's what we're looking to discuss today. So we've pulled together the best and brightest to really help us unpack all of this. Three of my absolute favorite minds and thinkers in Washington. So first we have Aubrey Ruby, of course, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council and our very own advisor here at Invest Africa. Jude Moore, Senior Policy Fellow at the Center for Global Development, and of course, a former Minister of Public Works in Liberia. And Cameron Hudson, Senior Fellow at CSIS, and of course, a former White House Director for African Affairs. Thanks very much to all of you for joining us. So maybe, Aubrey, if I can turn to you first to get things started. So maybe just sort of thinking as a business and investor active in African markets and trying to sort of make sense of these first 100 days and what's to come. What do we know about the Trump administration's Africa strategy? What's emerging as real policy and what's still very much speculative? And maybe what are some of the big opportunities you're seeing at this early stage that we can drill down on a little bit later on in this session? Aubrey.
Thank you, Johnny. Pleasure to be here with two dear friends and colleagues and everyone joining, and I hope we can have a robust conversation with lots of questions. I think that framing is very important. Here's what we do know, here's what we don't know, and then where are the opportunities? I think what we do know is that Africa policy fits within overall foreign policy in the U.S., and there's some things we know about that. We know that there's quite a push to retrench to kind of Monroe Doctrine views of the Americas. And that means that Africa policy is likely not to rank very high on the priorities within the 100 days, which is not so uncommon in administrations. Africa policy often is kind of later to come. And we often see that certain roles, for example, Assistant Secretary for Africa, are some of the later ones to be appointed. It's not just this administration, that's often true in many administrations. So we're still waiting for some of the key people. But we do know that this administration is prioritizing critical mineral diplomacy. So what we do see with vis-a-vis Ukraine is now somewhat being applied to the DRC. So I'm sure we'll get into that minerals deal a bit later. And the tariffs that was a global policy that the Trump administration took this past week. And I think we can say that if you look at the Lesotho case alone, the fact that Lesotho is paying some of the highest tariffs on exports to the US shows that there's kind of an undoing of 25 years of AGOA. Because those very apparel manufactured goods, jeans and otherwise, are what we've been trying to promote in Lesotho for the last 25 years. So I think Africa policy within the tariffs overall globally shows that they're not excluded in any way, they're not protected in any way. Countries like Madagascar, Mauritius as well also faced fairly high tariffs. We know that there are two camps within the administration, one that is very isolationist and wants to really kind of retrench to the oceans, and one that would like to be countering China, chess piece by chess piece across African markets. And which one of those kind of prevails overall is in the unknown category. We also know that DFC will be bigger. It will be more flexible coming out of this year. So this is the Development Finance Institution. For those who are listening, it's the U.S. Development Finance arm. And DFC already has the ability now to invest domestically, even though its mandate historically has been international. And in that context, I think Africa is going to constitute a smaller part of its portfolio than in years past. Maybe I'll save the opportunities to engage for later and turn over to Jude for his views over what we know and what we don't know, and kind of the beginning of an African response to some of these initiatives.
Thank you, Aubrey, and thanks to everybody. Again, Camera, Aubrey, it's great to see you guys again and be on here discussing this with you. I think I will just add a little bit to what Aubrey said about what we know and what we don't know. I think it's important to also point out that what we do know, it is possible that while we are speaking, or by the time we come to the end of our conversation here today, what we do know may have changed, right? Because everything is in flux. And it's not just, and to Aubrey's point, if you look at the impact of the administration's policies on the continent, you see that almost none of it is intentional. It's all incidental. USAID wasn't, oh, let's have an impact on Africa. It was something happening with USAID. But because USAID has such a large footprint in Africa, it looked as if it targeted Africa. If you look at the tariffs, it's everybody. So there's something about the administration that sort of feels uncertain, but not unusual. It's like COVID. This is not a situation in which Africa can turn to China, because China itself requires access to the US market. Everyone is trying to come up with some sort of vaccine for this new thing, right? Like you're trying to find some sort of response to the Trump administration. So it's global. And the third thing I would say, and I agree with Aubrey on, is that there has always been an isolationist strain in American politics. And it just depends on when and which version of that is ascendant. And we're seeing that now happen. And again, to Aubrey's point, even under the Biden administration, I went out of his way to sort of say, oh, our approach to Africa is different. Africa's actual rank in US foreign policy is not very high. And one of the things I'm doing a piece is that total US trade with Africa last year was around $71 billion. And I was just trading goods, because there's not much trading services. We don't export services here. We might import services. But US total combined service and goods trade with the rest of the world is 7 trillion. So 71 billion, it's not really big. And so if you don't have infinite resources and you're deploying resources, then even if the Trump administration had no animus toward the African continent, just in allocation of resources, Africa is not going to rank really, really high. However, there are African countries like your Madagascar, like your Mauritius, like your Lesotho, for whom this is really, really devastating. All right. The rest of them, your Chad, Nigeria, Angola, it looks as if petroleum is exempt. So because the bulk of their exports to the United States is petroleum, they probably will escape that. Kenya does some vaccine stuff. That stuff, pharmaceuticals are exempt. So Kenya might be. And because Kenya's tariff is 20% and Bangladesh's is 39 or 40, Kenya looks competitive compared to Bangladesh. So how African countries respond to this is going to be very difficult coming up with an African response, because it's so disparate in terms of the impact on each country. My hope, though, is that what comes out as sort of a response might be more of a united one than each of them trying to do separate deals. Because if you disaggregate 70 billion in total trade, they're too tiny to be dedicating resources to them. And the final thing I would say, we'll talk about this on the other end, is that the Trump administration's tariffs may have made it easier for us to push for AGOA reauthorization. So one of the problems with AGOA going forward was that on Capitol Hill, there was a resistance to unilateral tariffs, unilateral waiver of tariffs. There had to be something reciprocal. Well, it looks like Zimbabwe is ready to drop tariffs, and there are other countries, and Lesotho might be ready to play ball. So the thing we didn't want, where African governments opened up for U.S. products, it looks like the Trump administration's tariffs policy might make that possible. So there could be a deal that we can package with AGOA. I don't know what it looks like, but I think that's the beginning of one. I'll stop here, and we'll go back and forth on this. Thank you again.
Thanks for that, Jude. And maybe to pick up quickly on the AGOA piece, because of course the sunset is not too far in the distant future, right? It's just a couple of months away.
Yeah.
And if it is to be renewed, I guess what do you see it looking like? Do you see a sort of AGOA 2.0, or do you see maybe a sort of sector specific accord, maybe a regional approach, a little bit like MCC and other areas in the US government have taken before? Kind of what could AGOA look like in this new administration? Because it's for so long been, you know, the backbone, a real cornerstone of US Africa policy. So it almost seems crazy to think about a strategy, think about a policy without AGOA very much front of mind, right?
Mm. I'd imagine that it'll probably be, if I were advising the African side, Zambia, DRC, Mozambique, Tanzania, countries with significant deposits of critical minerals or natural gas. Those are the countries that would lead the negotiation. I would probably see in AGOA a preference, maybe a right of first refusal for American firms when it comes to critical, anything that centers the US and seems to develop direct benefits to the US. And then for some of the larger economies like South Africa and Nigeria, you probably see some reciprocal waivers granting US products, services, and goods access there. But it is going to be way more. The African side is going to give a lot more than they would have if it hadn't been the Trump administration, and being prepared to give more because it's going to be a deal. I imagine that's what it's going to look like.
No, fantastic. And maybe if I can shift from that to some of the sort of bilateral relationships that really are standing out at this early stage. I mean, I do want to get to Kenya and potential FTAs down the road a little bit later on, but maybe Cameron, can I bring you in on the other thing that's very much the talk of the town at the moment, right? Which is this potential minerals deal with the DRC. Obviously dominating the news at the moment. The new envoy or advisor was in the region just last week. But sort of what do we actually know at the moment about the deal structure, what it looks like, how it might evolve, and what's sort of a bit premature maybe in what we're seeing and reading in the news. Sort of what do you make of how this is evolving thus far?
Well, I think it's interesting that the minerals deal is reflective of, I think, a broader trend you're seeing around the world, and Africa is not immune to it, which is countries seeing the opportunity to deal make and to transact with the Trump administration. And so the DRC has come with this proposal, but let's remember the DRC is negotiating from a position of weakness. President Felix Tshisekedi is on his back foot in this conflict that he faces against Rwandan-backed M23 rebels in the Congo. He's losing deep popularity in the country. He's trying to build a new government of national unity, which no one seems to want to join. So he's really struggling politically. And so a lifeline for him is reaching out to the United States, drawing the United States into some kind of preferential minerals deal that would, I think the quid pro quo would be that we would somehow move in either politically or actually in a hard power sense to back him up from a security perspective to help either using our leverage to negotiate a withdrawal of the M23 and Rwandan forces or actually being, you know, even more militarily involved in some fashion. So we don't know what the contours of that deal will look like. I think it's interesting to note when the trip was announced of this U.S. envoy, who incidentally is Trump's daughter's father-in-law, so very much kind of in the family. that the announcement was made that we were going to the region to meet with heads of state and business leaders to resolve this conflict. And I think that that's an interesting window into how the Trump administration is viewing perhaps the security side of its engagement in Africa as well, right? That I think traditionally we have seen, U.S. Diplomacy, U.S. politics, U.S. investment, very much siloed in very different categories. And I think from that statement and from some of the early indications driven around this trip, we're seeing a real merger of all of these, security, political, and financial interests in these countries, so that you could see, very complex deals involving, in the case of Congo, you could imagine a kind of overarching political security and investment deal to emerge from what's happening in Congo right now. We have seen similarly the government, such as it is, of Somalia reaching out to the Trump administration last week as well, offering preferential access to Somali ports along the Red Sea. It knows very well that we are striking targets in Yemen against the Houthis, and that the Trump administration has articulated a priority in opening up Red Sea shipping lanes and securitizing those shipping lanes. Somalia is ideally placed, to do that given its geography. But here it is coming forward with its own deal, offering up these port access, presumably in exchange for the United States offering some kind of political bargain that would lend credibility and legitimacy to a Somali government, which is really struggling internally against a terrorist group, the Al-Shabaab, against ISIS insurgents and others. So, and I think that gets to sort of my last point that I'll make in this starting session is, I think from a kind of security political approach, you're going to see a narrowing of the Trump administration's interests in Africa. I think Aubrey and Judy have already rightly pointed out that Africa already has ranked low on the list of U.S. priorities. I think it won't necessarily go lower, but I think we will narrow the things that we care about. And I think they're going to be in three broad categories. We've already touched on one of them, which is the minerals piece. So if you are blessed with having critical minerals in your soil, then you're going to see probably more attention from the Trump administration. If you have a strategic location, like Somalia does, or some other countries on the Atlantic western coast of Africa, I think you'll likely see the Trump administration paying some attention. And then if you have a counterterrorism problem where the United States has a responsibility to play a role, and on that front, again, Somalia is one of those cases. We have seen the Trump administration strike 16 different times at targets in Somalia in the 2 months that it's been in office. That compares to 10 times in all of last year by the Biden administration taking strikes in Somalia. So clearly against ISIS and Al-Qaeda targets in Africa, which is the largest concentration of those terrorist groups is in Africa right now. We are seeing the Trump administration with a much higher operational tempo against counterterrorism targets. So I think those are going to be the three clear national security interests in Africa for the Trump administration.
And I think one thing that you bring up, Cameron, in those examples is when you hear them listed like you just have, for those of us who've been around a long time and commenting on the African-Chinese relationship, it's that, the same playbook that the Africans have been using with the Chinese is now applied to the U.S. So what are your strategic assets? What are you bringing to the table? What is the other party bringing to the table? And it's stripped away. It's stripped away the aid aspect. It's stripped away the pretense that, the U.S. is there to help develop African countries. All of that is being stripped away to just a pure deal-making, structure. And it'll be interesting to see which countries can rise to that kind of deal-making opportunity. because what is also clear is that this administration, because of all the government cuts, has fewer and fewer people to deal with these issues. So headcount at all these agencies, there's a human capital issue on the American negotiating side. Normally we talk about human capital and, capacity building on the African side. But here we will have that same problem. So if you take a DFC, for example, DFC has had a small headcount relative to its European peers for a long time. And in DFC reauthorization, it's likely to go from 60 billion lending cap, which is what it is today, to 100 to 120 billion. So a doubling, but not a doubling of people. In fact, fewer people. So it means that whoever does put forth deals, whether it be Uzbekistan or Kenya, has to actually do the work of putting together the deal and presenting it. Because, and this is going to Juday's point about, there is a real return to being organized and disciplined in this approach. Those who can put together the full deal will get it through. Because yes, in the Ukraine case, the US will invest people to work out the deal in a negotiated back and forth. But they're not going to on much smaller deals in African markets. So to me, it is an opportunity, but a challenge, because you have to be more organized. You have to do the hard work of project preparation before you can kind of present something on a silver platter to this administration.
Johnny, can I just take a
Please.
two-finger on what Aubrey just said there? Because, I think you're absolutely right. This is, personnel is policy, but you also need personnel. You also need just the people to do the work. And I think when we talk about the U.S. approach in Africa, traditionally, we talk of the sort of acronym that gets thrown about within government is the 3Ds, right? Diplomacy, development, and defense. Right. And right now we're talking about the possibility of our military command dedicated to Africa, which is AFRICOM, which is headquartered in Germany, having that folded into our European command. So getting rid of the combatant command that deals with Africa. So really the three-legged stool, talking about losing that leg of the stool. The development leg of the stool has already been lost with the closure of USAID. And then the diplomatic leg of the stool, we're talking about, there are rumors in Washington of potentially 6 to 12 African embassies being closed, just shut down, withdrawing U.S. diplomatic presence from as many as a quarter of the countries in Africa, right? That is an acknowledgement of these countries not mattering. That is an acknowledgement of, Doge cost savings or what have you. And again, I just remind people, this is all before the Doge team has even arrived at the State Department, right? We've been hearing about our foreign affairs agencies being kind of gutted of personnel, but the diplomatic staff has yet to see Doge arrive yet. And so we should anticipate and expect the parts of our government that work on issues in Africa, the democracy, human rights, labor, conflict prevention,
Consular visa issues.
consular issue, all of those, we're likely to see, a big retrenchment in the staffing around these things that are going to affect just the day-to-day ability to do business and to engage in any kind of relationship building.
And no question. I think what I would add to that is to Aubrey's point about, the sort of the playbook that we've had with the Chinese. I'll go further than that and actually think about your global commodity traders. Think about Glencore coming into the country. Glencore isn't coming into the country to develop your education and stuff. You have a mineral that Glencore needs to extract. You negotiate a deal with Glencore. And when you think about negotiating with the United States, now if you're an African government, that's what you have to think about. One of the reasons, and maybe naively, why I keep pushing that the African response, they need to go out of their way to do a concerted collective responses, because 22 African countries are either landlocked or small island nations. Like, what does Malawi have to offer the United States for a deal? All right. Comoros with vanilla and cloves. Like so for the African countries that actually have something that it can do with a deal, there aren't that many. And so to the point that both Aubrey and Cameron made, the Kenyan FTA started during the negotiations started during the first Trump administration, 2020. This is 2025. I don't know if we're anywhere closer to a deal. The Moroccan FTA took about 2 years to negotiate, but about 4 years to actually come into force. Negotiating an FTA requires significant man hours. This is happening at exactly the moment. The USTR has always been small. So I don't think Doge is going to have an impact on USTR, but Treasury, Commerce, the USTR's counterparts in the rest of government that helps them negotiate, this is not there. So if you are the Trump administration, you're probably going to focus on the partners who can hurt the United States. China's 34% retaliatory means China is at the front of the line if you're negotiating anything. The Austrian president suggested that European targeted retaliation focus on states and tech companies that support Trump, right? So if you're the Trump administration, if you're going to do any deals, you're going to look at the countries capable of hurting you. There are no countries in Africa, even the combination of countries in Africa that are capable of hurting the US in that way. And so when we think about this, I think the final thing I would say that sort of ties the Trump administration's approach to global commodity traders in Africa is the idea that there's an executive order suspending the enforcement of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, right? The idea is to make it easier for American firms to do business vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis others for whom this is not a binding issue. So I think packaging something, and I'll come back to the point that Aubrey made, it used to be possible that we didn't have a capable foreign policy in terms of the state, capable state in doing foreign policy and get away with it because development was such a big thing. But with development gone, with Cambodia and Vietnam and Taiwan suspending tariffs and wanting to do deals, with everyone else trying to do deals, there is a possibility here that in Africa that is not organized in how it responds is going to be left by the roadside, not intentionally, not because there's animus toward them, but simply because what is left of the administration and the federal government to negotiate is so under pressure now, so pressed for men, for competence. You have to remember, if you fire 20,000 people from a workforce of 80,000, that's a significant amount of historical memory, competence that is lost. And so I think for us in Africa, the time has come now for a number of things. One, we have to find a way to cover the cost of coordination and work together. Two, we have to invest in competence, which means in the short term, hiring consultants to help you do this. In the long term, actually building your workforce that's capable of doing this. But to Aubrey's point, more money to invest, less people to work through the deals. What deals you bring, whether you're bringing it to DFC or to the State Department, has to be fait accompli, has to be completely done and ready to go, so that because the US just doesn't have the resources to dedicate toward Africa, not because they don't like us, just because in terms of economic value, 71 billion out of 7 trillion, it's hard to make that case.
No, thanks, Judy. Gosh, Aubrey, it reminds me of the 3% rule, right, in your book 10 odd years ago.
And it still is. Africa constitutes less than 3% of global trade.
Yeah. Maybe to zoom in, one, I should mention, please, to remind everyone, please do drop your questions in the chat. We'll try to incorporate them as we're going and want to make this as interactive and engaging as possible. So if you have questions for the group, please drop them in the chat. But maybe to zoom in, obviously there's been lots of talk on the DFC, and I know it's something that all three of you follow very, very closely. There's obviously new leadership that's been nominated, at least, a big reauthorization coming later this year. And tremendous potential. And for so many people listening in today, the DFC is a very natural partner in the US government, right? For so many of them, it's actually the first touch point, right, when they're engaging with USG. So really, I guess a question for the group, kind of what direction do you see DFC taking? And do you think it's really going to double down on sort of international exposure? Or obviously there's been talk, certainly from Elon Musk and others, of it sort of looking more domestically at sort of nearshore deals, leaving African projects perhaps competing for financing and capital in other areas. So how do we see the DFC evolving in the next few years, and what the opportunities for Africa-focused corporates and investors?
So maybe I can jump in on that because, and I apologize in advance if this conversation gets a bit technical, but it's important to differentiate a couple things. The DFC's current mandate by law is still to invest internationally, but the most recent executive order on March 20th told the DFC that it should invest domestically, but using Defense Department authorizations. So the budget it has already set, so it's Lindy cap of 60 billion, that's still dedicated to international. It has authorities through the Defense Department to be able to invest domestically. And there was a question in the chat about critical minerals and refining capacity. So whoever asked that is absolutely right. The main constraint in the US is refining capacity for critical minerals. And if you look at that executive order, it tells DFC to focus on local processing in the United States through those Defense Department authorizations. So what I would say is that a lot will depend on the congressional reauthorization if it changes its actual mandate and allows it to put its own money domestically as well, not just Defense Department authorizations. So that's unknown, but there are bills being drafted right now. What I think is more known is that in those reauthorizations, a DFC will have a greater geographic focus. So historically, it's been focused more on LDCs, lower, by the kind of lower income countries. And it hasn't been able to do middle income like Argentina. That will change, and DFC will be able to do Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Peru, these countries. And so overall, if you take that picture, it will reduce the share for Africa, in my view, because DFC will have larger money to dedicate. You'll have bigger like checkbook, if you will, and they'll have fewer check writers. So they will seek to write bigger checks, and African deals routinely are smaller. And so this is the disconnect. It will be bigger checks, and then there will be a bigger geographic range that the DFC can look at. But today it can invest domestically, but via the Defense Department. So hopefully that helps to clarify. Now, in those negotiations with the Defense Department, because if you look at the executive order on March 20th, it tells the DFC to coordinate and work closely with DOD, and that they have to come up with joint plans. But remember, in DOD experience, the Defense Department, they have their full political leadership in place. They have a defense secretary, they have the undersecretaries, they have all of their political leadership in place. The DFC, though, has it nominated, but not a political leadership in place. That makes it challenging for them to negotiate. And so I think what you'll see in the nearest term is Defense Department have a lot of sway over what DFC invests in domestically in the near term, just because it's A, their money and authorities, and B, they have their political leadership in place, so they can more easily get responses and interactions from the White House. So I'll stop because I dumped a lot of technical detail on the audience, and there may be some questions, but I think it's important to kind of differentiate those pieces.
I would just add, Johnny, just add quickly that sometime last year, I did an event with European development banks. It was hosted by the Belgian Development Bank. And one of the questions that came, I think it was from IFD, but the first question that came was, and this has come up, you asked Aubrey about this, it says, here we want to invest in Africa, but, there is no deal flow. There is no pipeline of projects that are investable and ready. So when I was teaching in China, I had a meeting with one of the two Chinese funds that are established to invest in Africa, and that's CAT Fund and then CAFIC. And the issue they raised also, at least, was size of deals and availability of deals, which brings me back to this point. the average deal in Africa is not going to be a massive one. It's not going to be very big. So that already puts you on the back burner, right? Because DFC, without having as many people, it means that the same amount of due diligence that goes into developing a $10 million project will go into a $100 million project. I'm doing more 100 million projects than 10 million projects, and your projects in Africa tend to be smaller. It comes back to this point of the continent and its governments, its regional institutions will now have to dedicate significant amount of resources to doing that hard work that in the past you expected. If European MDBs were complaining about deal flow when everything was great, I want you to imagine what that atmosphere looks like now. And so I know AFC, I know Africa 50 have been dedicating resources to project development, but we have to lean into that for everything we do, especially in our dealing with the US government and whatever the new DFC looks like.
So there was a question about this project development piece here. And I think the question asker was getting at, should you kind of think about it, going to US TDA for this piece, going to XM for this piece, DFC for this piece. I think it's a little too early to know that, because what's being circulated in Washington right now is a memo that outlines, in theory, what the administration is going to push for when it comes to the future of, say, TDA. And that is that, in theory, it could move under DFC. So maybe DFC as a whole would be more of a one-stop shop, so to say. But that's a little bit unknown. Right now, what is known is US TDA is pins down. They're not writing a single new project, et cetera, because they're part of the foreign assistance halt. So that is, they're not doing any new deals. In terms of XM Bank, US XM is bigger and better than it's ever been. It also is focused on a lot on critical minerals. It has something called the Supply Chain Resiliency Initiative, which was also mentioned in the March 20th executive order. And US XM Bank is going to be reauthorized next year. But what is true is they already have their board in place, and they're already doing deals. So even though their leadership, political leadership, has been nominated but not confirmed, they have a very strong transition team still there, and they have their board members, and they're doing deals. So XM is operating as business as usual. And when we go into reauthorization, they have to be reauthorized by, I think, mid next year to 2026. And most likely they're going to have their cap heightened, which means that their default cap, which is very low right now at 2%, they can only handle a 2% default, which means they're very conservative. If that gets increased, they will be much more risk taking, and that would be exciting. Now, XM is debt resources. So USTDA was grant for feasibility. XM is debt resources. DFC has mostly debt, but some equity as well. And in DFC reauthorization, those equity issues that it's had in terms of its ability to do a lot of equity deals will be fixed. And so DFC will become more of an equity player, which means it will be able to take more risk. But we are in a period where there's a lot of uncertainty over our kind of development finance architecture. So you'll have to watch the space a little bit to see what happens to Millennium Challenge Corporation, what happens with TDA. It's not yet fully known. And actually what happens to the rest of the money that was allocated for US aid, but that wasn't spent. I assume it will go to State Department, but it's been allocated by Congress, and I think it's somewhere around 8 billion that is still unspent. So hopefully that helps to answer that question from the audience.
Really good points, Aubrey. Maybe to zoom in now on a specific project that obviously has been dominating the news cycle as well, which is all things Lobito corridor, right? I think it's emerged as a real flagship of multiple administrations now, right? It goes back several presidents, the general concept at least. Do you, and I guess this is a question for the group, do you see this as a one-off, or is it potentially a model for sort of future US-backed infrastructure plays on the continent? Could we see a similar project in West Africa, in East, And obviously it's a project that DFC, that Exim, that all of these players that you just mentioned are very much involved in. So how do you see Lobito progressing in this administration? And do you see it as a model for things to come? Who wants to tackle that one first? Maybe
Camera was gonna go since I spoke, but I can go. I think there are some. I think there's some who are sort of imposing their hopes on what they're seeing and interpreting that more in their hopes than what we know. I like how we started the conversation about things we know and things we do not. It is what we don't know. Well, there are inclinations that the US might continue with this. However, this hasn't come from Washington. This came from the American ambassador there. So we have to wait. It is possible, like I said, that there are parts of the government where people with authority have a different idea of where they want to go, and then something else could come from the White House that changes that. We do know, at least from what we've heard from the ambassador, the US is still interested in that. But one has to remember that the Biden administration was not simply a port to mine rail. It was supposed to be something more, right? You were developing the ecosystem along the corridor. It was like a development project, developing the corridor so that women could have access, so that other things would have access. It seems to me, at least listening to the ambassador, they're interested in a rail to mine thing. So one possibility of the outcome of a new Lobito, or what Lobito looks like, is everything else that was about developing an economic corridor is stripped of it, and what remains is simply a transport infrastructure that takes critical minerals out of the heart of Africa or from the interior and exports it, and that's all that gets done. Which means that how much resources the US is willing to dedicate was completely changed, right? And so back to Aubrey's point, until we're pretty clear what the US development architecture looks like, it's unclear what we can say about this. So if I were to advise an African government on this, I would not interpret this as the US being just as committed as, say, the previous administration was. I would see this as a one-off deal. If it ends up being more than a one-off deal, how does that hurt you? Right? But if you plan for it to be bigger than a one-off deal and it doesn't come to that, that can hurt you. So I think from my perspective and what we've seen, because we know so little and we haven't heard much from the administration, at least here in Washington, about that, I'll go with, if it goes forward, it's going to be a one-off deal stripped of all of the attendant issues that were attached to it and simply see it as just a transport deal.
Yeah, I mean, I see it continuing in some way, shape, or form. I don't think it, there was bipartisan support. I don't think it it aligns with the current kind of Trump administration's interests and concerns. Will they champion it? Maybe not in the same way, but letting it go through DFC to honor its contracts and its agreements, why not? I do think that there may be other corridor mining projects that get proposed and developed on the continent, and that could be a way forward. And so to me, that is a real possibility, whether that be, through Mozambique or, a Namibia one, or through Walvis Bay, or whomever puts forth an interesting one. Obviously, what's being discussed right now with the DRC mineral deal has elements of that. I've seen various versions that even talk about creating some kind of industrial zone in the east that's obviously really a security zone. And so again, I think those kind of big projects across multiple countries could be a very interesting angle to go, to Jude's point. And MCC might be an interesting counterparty in those. So I put forth those kind of ideas as maybe a way forward. I think, Jude, might be interesting to hear what you say about the role of the AU and whether it can be a good negotiating per one of the questions here.
Quickly before camera comes in, I think, yeah, the AU might stand a better chance. I think, okay, so if you're doing AGOA, you definitely don't want the South Africans leading the delegation. Right, right. I mean, in terms of how you create your negotiating, probably not South Africa. I think South Africa, Kenya, who've benefited from AGOA, understand how it works, can provide secretariat, can cover the expenses of your negotiator if you're negotiating as a unit. But please don't send the South Africans now, because it's just not the best thing for the AU. I, it, because of his credibility, because of his reach, because of his size, it makes sense to be the AU. But I don't know if the AU's done a trade deal. I don't know if the AU's done a deal, or the AU is at a set up to be able to negotiate with the US government in this form. So maybe it's the AFCFTA, since they already have a secretariat, since they already have some competence on this, maybe add more resources to them, and they, on behalf of the AU, sort of leads the negotiation on behalf. But it comes back to our point, the point that we made earlier, that it used to be possible to get away with not being as organized, dealing with the rest of the world. But things have so shifted. I should add, though, that what we're seeing in the US is just the most extreme version. But all across Europe, the export credit agencies, the development financing has been changing and becoming more and more commercial, right? We're just seeing a harsher version of it from the United States. So it's not as if, this came out of the blue. This has been a trend in development assistance, and just the Trump administration has pushed it. So whether it's the AU, or is the AFCFTA, or is a coalition of the willing that have benefited more from AGOA, whatever form that takes, it has to be some of the most competent negotiators we've had. And it might mean, hiring people to do it. The one final thing I'll add is, when the Chinese renegotiated their deal, their alone with the Republic of Congo, the team negotiating for China were lawyers from London, right? So there's nothing that says when we go into negotiations, every single person on the delegation should be African. There's no reason why we should just hamper ourselves and tie ourselves down making that. There are people who can lead this negotiation if we're willing to spend money on that. And I think that's the direction we've got to look in.
And maybe Cameron, can I bring you in on this? I know you're tracking the minerals deal very closely. Do you see it as a model of things to come? And I guess if we can sort of name some names, I mean, it sounds like from what all of you have said that there are sort of a few key African markets that really have a lot to gain, maybe in this administration, and then quite a few that potentially really don't. As unfortunate as that may sound. So maybe to drill down on those 2 points. So where do we see the minerals deal going? Is it a sign of things to come in other areas? And if yes, what are some of those key markets that have a lot to gain in the years to come?
Sure. Well, I mean, listen, I think that we've established that there's likely to be more of those kinds of deals. I think there's a point that hasn't been made, which I would just sort of underline, which is that I think that there is going to be a kind of a political overlay to all of these deals. This idea of friend shoring. This is a big theme that we're hearing from the president and from the Secretary of State, right? So we're not going to do these deals in countries that vote against us at the United Nations. So I think the Trump administration is going to be very clear about who the winners and losers are, as to whether or not you are, in their eyes, loyal to positions that the United States holds. And I think that the quintessential example, and frankly, a country that the United States is very intentionally making an example of right now, is South Africa. Right, they are sending a message, multiple messages based upon a variety of constituencies that this administration is trying to keep happy. And I think Aubrey kind of touched on this at the very opening. You have these kind of retrenchment activists within the administration, and globalists within the administration. But you also have, a kind of like very, hardcore pro-Israel component that he has to satisfy. You have, in the South Africa context, you have people like, maybe Stephen Miller or Stephen Bannon, who have picked up on the kind of anti-white DEI components of the South African domestic policy and foreign policy, right? They said that they're not going to participate in the G20 this year, which South Africa is hosting, because of the kind of DEI elements that are part of that agenda. And so I think we have to be, cognizant of the fact that um, that the Trump administration is going to view its foreign policy and its Africa policy through a lot of the domestic politics and domestic lenses that it's engaged in, domestic policies through. So that overlay again has typically not been something that we have brought um, to bear in our foreign policy. And I think it's one of the reasons why a country like South Africa is really going to struggle to get on the right side of the United States, because it isn't just one constituency, right? It's the globalists who are angry at South Africa's support of the BRICS, and and our support, South Africa's support of expanding this alliance of BRICS states, presumably against United States interests. It's the Bannons who see the DEI components of South African policy. It's the others who want to punish South Africa for their alignment with Russia and China and Iran and other countries. So there's a multitude of reasons why South Africa is on the losing end of that. And I think you're going to see other countries experiencing, similar kind of criticism. And so as we talk about deal making that's going to be done, that component, that lens, is definitely going to be one that the administration looks through, and they're going to look at their voting record. They're going to look at their kind of loyalty to the administration, and countries that are deemed to be disloyal in some way will, I think, be shut out of U.S. markets. And this gets back to, I think, one of the questions, on AGOA, where we have heard the president and those around him say, why would we give away access to the wealthiest market in the world for people that don't support us at the UN, who vote against us on issues that are critical to us? And so I think that you're going to see more and more AGOA and these deals going to countries that have demonstrated their loyalty, who have demonstrated their alignment with U.S. policies and U.S. interests. And if you don't, I think there's a good likelihood that you're shut out of those deals and out of that access.
Thanks, Cameron. In the time we have remaining, I do want to quickly touch on the third D that you mentioned in your opening remarks. Obviously, we've covered diplomacy quite extensively, and some concerning things down the road, perhaps there, with the closure of U.S. embassies in key markets across the continent. We've touched development quite a bit with significant changes with USAID and whatnot. But to touch on defense, I mean, you mentioned a sort of uptick in kinetic engagements in Somalia, and obviously in recent years we've seen a real erosion in so many ways of sort of Western security engagement across the continent, not just obviously with the US, but also with France, with other allies as well. So I guess, what do you think the administration's vision is here? Does it have one, and how do you see it evolving? And what maybe are some of the big implications for investors, for corporates on the continent as well?
Well, I think that the Trump administration, if we remember back to the first term, their intention was to remove all U.S. forces from Africa. They started to do that in Somalia, and as a result, a few years later, we've seen an uptick in terrorist forces and a regroupment of ISIS in the country. So there are consequences to that military and security retrenchment. That still seems to be a trend, I think, in this second, Trump 2.0 administration. I think there's open question right now in terms of what we don't know about what approach they will take in a place like Central Africa or the Sahel, where the United States has traditionally been very much involved in support of European allies. I think as we see this kind of, broader breakdown in U.S. European security relations over NATO, and whether or not Europeans step forward to contribute 5% of GDP to NATO, I think that will play out in an African context as well. And you will see Washington, I think the Trump administration, less likely to support European security objectives in Africa, traditionally in Northern Africa and the Sahel, where they see a migration problem and a terrorism problem potentially moving northward into Europe. I think you could see the Trump administration decide to say, that we don't have a dog in that hunt, right? We're not going to be interested in backing up European security partners or traditional European security partners in a place like Africa. So I think that that's likely to be the move that we see from the Trump administration, along with the kind of general cost cutting approach to everything that they're doing, which is why we're having this debate about whether or not we fold up the U.S. Africa Command, and whether we begin to rely, which we haven't talked on yet, on more kind of middle power and third party countries that are clearly playing a much greater role in Africa. We have not talked about the role of Turkey, Saudi Arabia, UAE, all of whom are developing real mercantilist policies towards Africa, investment, security, political. They're taking a page out of the traditional U.S. playbook, and pursuing it in a very aggressive way across much of Africa right now. And I think there are those in the Trump administration who say they have more of a stake in the game. They have more leverage than we do. Let them have it. And so, you're seeing the Trump administration step back from supporting European allies and ceding a lot of territory to new entrants from these middle powers.
Oh gosh, very interesting.
Can I just
please.
quickly add, Johnny, is that it seems like the Trump administration is trying to relearn the old lessons the hard way. Part of the reason U.S. Security footprint expanded in Africa, we'll go back to the USS Cole bombing in Yemen, the embassy bombings in Tanzania and in Kenya, and this idea that in ungoverned spaces, there's a possibility of threats emerging from there that could actually threaten American interests, whether it's on the homeland or elsewhere, whether those are commercial interests or just the presence and safety of U.S. citizens. So the retrenchment, to Cameron's point, would come at a cost. But obviously, we're seeing this happen everywhere, right? The U.S. has an FTA with Morocco. It has trade. The USMC was negotiated by the Trump administration, and they're repudiating it. So I think we're going to learn old lessons the hard way. But definitely, the retrenchment is not going to simply be in the diplomacy and in the development. I think we're also going to see it in defense. I know in Mark Esper's book, he did say that the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, actually considered shutting down all U.S. embassies on the continent. So this time around, we're probably going to see some version of that. And my fear is that we'll learn the old lessons the hard way.
Maybe to wrap up with some optimism, though, maybe a piece of advice for to leave everyone with, I guess, if a question for all three of you: what is your best advice to investors, to corporates, trying to navigate all of this, right? Maybe Aubrey, can I start with you?
Sure. I mean, to corporates, I think if you have meaningful deals that are sitting at the nexus of African interest and U.S. interest, develop those deals and bring them to the right players in Washington, because there's going to be a flood, let's say in the critical minerals, there's a flood of new people doing funds, but not many meaningful deals. So part of it is to ignore the noise and get to work and develop some meaningful deals. So that's one. The second, on kind of African governments and African businesses, I mean, listen, the way that Trump does business is not unlike, as I say to my Nigerian friends, Oga politics. Like, you deeply understand the kind of big man, access to the family, advisors that don't necessarily have formal titles. All of that is very familiar to an African context. In fact, I think at one point, Trevor Noah in the first Trump administration called him the first African president, because of how he approached things, right? And so because of that, I think African countries may get how to deal with him, negotiate with him, and access him better than, say, Asian countries. So to me, I think that there's a real opportunity to navigate it with the kind of a deal first approach. And I think we might have lost Johnny, so maybe Jude, over to you on your last thoughts.
Sure. I think I'll go back to my point that the AGOA is really important for a small number of African countries because most African countries do not export to the US. When they do, it's pretty tiny. Like Liberia sent like $955,000 worth of palm oil, right? However, for Africa's industrialization dreams, AGOA is important. So the pitch we make as Africans is one, you should build your factories in Africa because we're creating a single market in the AFCFTA. Oh, and by the way, you have tariff and quota-free access on 7,000 products to the US market. It makes sense for you to invest in Africa. So even for countries that are not using AGOA at the moment, retaining access to the world's largest consumer market makes absolute sense. So my hope is, at least whether it's come from the AFCFTA or it comes from the African Union, that there is some sort of a collective African response to this. And my hope is we can use AGOA reauthorization as the vehicle for being able to do that. Maybe I'm too optimistic, but that's what I think is the best way forward for us.
So I would just say, going back to something I said earlier, I think it's about the narrative. I think that it's this administration is constructing these deals that have a political component, a security component, an investment component, and I think to the extent that you can and anyone can present themselves as not just making good financial sense, but contributing to a broader set of strategic objectives that this administration has, how it fits in to that broader strategic framework. This administration is no longer doing development for development's sake, right? It's no longer doing it because a safer, more prosperous world and a safer, more prosperous Africa makes America safe. That kind of truism that I think many administrations have held on to is no longer true. And you have to justify why these deals make sense for the Trump administration to support, and how, what they get out of it, to use their language. And so thinking about that narrative and constructing deals that have that kind of component, or at least that understanding, I think will be, if you're looking for U.S. government support for those deals, is going to be critical.
Thanks very much to all three of you. Really appreciate your time and insights today. Hopefully, I think I saw in the chat someone asked if we could do these quarterly, so hopefully we'll have you back very soon. Maybe a quick word on some things coming up for Invest Africa. We'll actually be in Washington later this month for the Bank Fund spring meetings, having a series of engagements with a few ministers of finance and central bank governors, and hoping to have strong engagement from a number of the US agencies that we spoke about a lot today, with Exim, DFC, and others. And then, of course, our major Africa debates in London in July, and in Dubai on the 30th of September as well. So hope to see you all there. And thanks very much for your time, and thanks for your insights, Cameron, Aubrey, and Jude. Until next time.